On the southern edge of the Arabian Peninsula, Yemen sits on a living seam where the planet's crust has been pulling apart for millions of years, as if the Earth is quietly unzipping itself. And just offshore, Socotra feels like a biological accident that never got corrected. Strange trees, bleeding red, resin plants found nowhere else. Landscapes that look borrowed from a different world. Then there are the city's mud brick towers rising in stacked patterns as if architecture learned to climb before modern steel ever existed. So what happens when a land is both a fracture line and a sanctuary, both fragile and impossibly enduring? And who keeps a place alive when the ground, the climate, and history never stop shifting? Yemen's landscape begins with a quiet contradiction. It is often imagined as a single sun-baked desert, yet the country is built like a stepped amphitheater, coastal plains that shimmer with heat, a sudden wall of mountains, then a high plateau where air thins and nights can feel surprisingly cold. This is not a gentle rise. In many places, the land lifts abruptly from the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, forming an escarpment that looks as if the continent has been tilted upward by invisible hands. That invisible force is geology. Yemen sits near one of the most dramatic, unfinished stories on Earth, a region where tectonic plates have been stretching and cracking, creating the rift systems of the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. Over immense spans of time, this pulling apart reshapes coastlines, opens basins, and stirs volcanic heat beneath the crust. The result is a country that feels restless, even when it is still, where mountains carry the memory of uplift, and coastal flats carry the memory of seas advancing and retreating. In the west, the Tihama coastal plain runs along the Red Sea, low, hot, and bright with humidity that clings to skin and wind, that tastes faintly of salt. From there, the terrain climbs quickly into the western highlands, a mountainous spine that catches more rainfall than the lowlands and becomes the engine of Yemen's most iconic human adaptation, terraced agriculture. Seen from above, these terraces look like contour lines, made visible stone and soil arranged in layered steps across steep slopes, slowing runoff, holding moisture, and turning gravity into a tool. Higher up the plateau, around Sana'a and the central highlands, can feel like a different latitude. The light sharpens, shadows deepen. In the far distance, peaks rise above the plateau. Among them, Jabal an-Nabi Shuaib, roughly 3,666 meters, the highest point on the Arabian Peninsula. The presence of such elevation changes the entire logic of weather. It creates pockets of cooler air, seasonal rains, and a patchwork of microclimates valleys that trap warmth ridges that take the wind slopes that grow greener on one face and stay austere on the other. Yet Yemen is not only mountains and coast. The country is also shaped by water that is mostly absent and therefore powerful. Rain arrives unevenly, and when it does, it can come quickly. Dry riverbeds, wadis can transform into sudden torrents, carving channels through rock and soil, then disappearing again, leaving behind smooth stones and the illusion that nothing happened. Over centuries, these wadis have drawn the boundaries of settlement and movement. They are corridors, lifelines, and sometimes hazards proof that even scarce water can be a sculptor. If Yemen's west is defined by steep ascent, parts of the east unfold into broader, harsher spaces, plateaus and valleys that feel open-ended where the horizon seems to retreat as one approaches it. Here, the land can look older, more weathered, and more exposed. And this is where the idea of endurance begins to feel geological, not just human rock layers stacked like Page's canyon walls like torn paper, and long distances where silence becomes a presence of its own. Volcanic traces thread through this story as well. Yemen's highlands and surrounding regions include volcanic fields and ancient lava flows, dark stone that absorbs heat by day and releases it at night, creating yet another rhythm in the climate. Volcanism does not always announce itself with eruptions. Sometimes it appears as shape and texture, cones softened by time, basalt plains, ridges that look poured rather than carved. Even without spectacle, the implication is clear. The crust here has been warmed, stressed, and reshaped from below. Then the country's geography makes one more sudden turn out to sea. Off Yemen's southern coast, Socotra rises like a separate chapter. Its isolation is part of its power. Geologically, it carries a blend of ancient rock and limestone plateaus, sculpted by wind and rare rains into stark forms that can feel otherworldly. Monsoon winds can slam the island with seasonal force, and the coastline can switch from calm to violent depending on the time of year. On land, the interior can appear almost lunar pale stone, hard light, sparse shade, until vegetation interrupts the austerity with shapes that look invented rather than evolved. In Yemen, the line between land and ocean is not simply a border. It is a gateway. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, narrow, strategic, and heavily traveled, seats at the entrance to the Red Sea, turning Yemen's southern edge into a hinge between continents and trade routes. Geography here is never only scenery. It is pressure, opportunity, and vulnerability all at once. And so, the terrain becomes more than a backdrop for a documentary. It becomes a living logic that explains everything that follows: why towns cling to ridges or hide in valleys, why terraces climb like stairways, why ports mattered, why isolation could preserve wonders, and why scarcity could shape culture as much as abundance. Because if the ground itself has been shifting for ages, pulled apart, lifted up, cut by water, and written over by wind, what does stability even mean in a place like this? Yemen's ecology is often misunderstood for the same reason its geography is the mind expects one climate, one palette, one predictable set of life. But Yemen is stitched together from sharp transitions, sea to plain, plain to cliff to high plateau. So nature responds with variety. Life here is not spread evenly like a blanket. It gathers where conditions allow it, then disappears again, as if the land is testing how much living matter it can afford to hold. Along the western escarpments and highlands, rainfall, however seasonal, changes everything. The terraces that climb the mountainsides are not only agriculture, they are habitat. Stone walls trap soil and moisture, creating small islands of green in a landscape that otherwise sheds water too quickly. In these pockets, trees and shrubs, anchor slopes, insects and birds follow the vegetation, and the mountains gain a second skin, one that looks cultivated from a distance, yet functions like an ecosystem engineered to survive scarcity. In the higher elevations, the air cools, and certain plant communities hold on, where they can, among them, juniper woodlands, in parts of the Yemeni highlands, remnants of a greener past. These are not endless forests. They are fragile strongholds shaped by altitude grazing pressure and changing weather. And with them comes a cast of birds, whose names sound almost like geographic coordinate species, tied to South Arabia's heights and rocky slopes, small tough, adapted to thin air, sharp sun, and the logic of cliffs. Then there is the coastline, low, bright, and intense. The Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden bring marine productivity, while the Tihama Plain endures heat that can feel relentless. Here, life makes different bargains, timing activity to cooler hours living close to water, enduring salt and wind. Even where vegetation looks sparse, it is rarely absent. It is simply cautious, low thorny, conserving moisture, refusing to waste energy on anything that does not help it persist. But Yemen's most startling ecological chapter lies offshore, where the sea becomes a moat around an island that evolution treated like a private laboratory, the Socotra archipelago. Socotra's fame is not just beauty. It is difference measurable, documented, almost unbelievable. The islands hold 825 plant species, and 307 of them, about 37%, are endemic, meaning they exist nowhere else on Earth. That level of endemism is the kind that makes biologists reach for superlatives, because it suggests long isolation and long experimentation by nature. On Socotra, the signature silhouette is the dragon's blood tree, an umbrella-shaped canopy balanced on a thick trunk as if designed for harsh light and scarce water. The red resin that gives it its name feels mythic, but the ecology is practical. The tree's form helps capture moisture from fog and humidity funneling it down into the soil. In a dry landscape, a tree like that becomes more than a plant. It becomes infrastructure, providing shade, stabilizing ground, supporting other species that shelter beneath it. Yet the most cinematic creatures often carry the most delicate futures. Reports from journalists and scientists describe dragons' blood forests as increasingly overmature stands of old trees, with too few young ones rising to replace them. Stronger cyclones have uprooted trees that took centuries to grow. Goats essential to local livelihoods can also be devastating when grazing pressure becomes too intense, eating seedlings before they ever become saplings. Climate stress tightens the equation further. Less predictable, rainfall, harsher extremes, and fewer safe years for slow-growing species to regenerate. A forest can look alive, green canopies, dramatic silhouettes, while quietly losing its future underneath. Socotra's biodiversity is not only terrestrial. Its waters are part of the storied marine ecosystems shaped by currents, upwelling, and the mixing of sea systems near the Arabian Sea. Coral, fish, seabirds, and coastal life form another layer of richness, one that can be harder to film, but impossible to ignore. Even Socotra's birds reflect its uniqueness. Conservation sources point to numerous important bird areas identified across the archipelago, hinting at how many migrations, nests, and survival strategies converge on these windswept rocks. Back on the mainland, Yemen's wildlife becomes more elusive and, in some cases, more endangered. Few animals carry as much symbolic weight as the Arabian leopard, assessed as critically endangered, with estimates of only around 120 individuals remaining across its range. This is the kind of number that changes the meaning of a sighting. It turns a footprint into a headline, a shadow into a question. In Yemen's rugged landscapes, such a predator would traditionally move through remote mountains and broken terrain places where human presence is thin, where survival depends on secrecy and patience. But small populations are vulnerable to everything at once: habitat loss, decline of prey, conflict, and the simple brutality of chance. That vulnerability is a theme that repeats across Yemen's ecosystems. When water is limited, biodiversity does not only depend on nature. It depends on stability, social and environmental. It depends on whether grazing can be managed, whether forests can recover, whether protected areas can be enforced, whether community knowledge can be passed on, whether the next season arrives in time. The most important ecological truth here may be this: in Yemen, life has always been an agreement between landscape and behavior. That is why Yemen's biodiversity cannot be portrayed as a museum exhibit. It is not static. It is living negotiation. Terraces are rebuilt stone by stone after storms. Herds move across highlands and valleys in patterns learned over generations. Islands guard species that can't simply relocate when conditions change. And predators at the top of the food chain vanish first when the system begins to fray. So, the ecology of Yemen is not merely what lives here. It is also what can still live here and under what conditions. Because when a country holds an island where evolution ran wild mountains, where microclimates create pockets of green, and coastlines where heat and salt set the rules, the real mystery becomes sharper. What kind of human history grows out of such a landscape? And how does culture form when survival itself demands invention? In Yemen, human history does not read like a straight line. It reads like terraces, built in steps, repaired after damage, held together by patience. The first truth is geographical people did not simply settle Yemen. They negotiated with it. They learned where rain pauses long enough to matter, where stone can hold a wall, where a valley becomes a corridor, where a ridge becomes safety. High in the mountains, terraces climb slopes that look too steep to be useful. Yet for thousands of years, those steps have turned gravity into agriculture. Evidence suggests that terracing in Yemen reaches deep into the ancient past, an early answer to a hard question: how can food be grown where soil would otherwise wash away? Over time, terraced fields became more than farmland. They became a social system. A community could be read in the lines of its walls, who maintained them, who shared water, who repaired damage after a storm, who inherited a plot, who left, who stayed. And water? Always, water shaped culture as much as it shaped valleys. In places where rainfall is seasonal and unpredictable, the act of capturing it becomes a kind of philosophy. Cisterns, channels, and careful timing turned into inherited knowledge. Survival depended on memory. When the rains usually come, where they usually fail, how to plant for a year that might disappoint. But the story of early Yemen is not only mountain villages and fieldwork, it is also movement caravans crossing the southern Arabian plateau ports that face the sea and the long, fragrant commerce of incense. For ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, South Arabia was not a blank on the map. It was a source of luxury and ritual frankincense and myrrh traveling north by camel, then out again across empires and languages. Yemen's position near key sea lanes and land routes made it a hinge between Africa and Arabia, between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, between inland kingdoms and coastal exchanges. So the question becomes sharper in a land where climate makes every harvest uncertain. How did wealth and civilization grow at all? And what kind of society forms when trade winds caravan routes and scarce rain all pull on the same thread? One answer rises from the desert edge near Marib, where ancient engineers attempted something almost audacious to turn a valley into an oasis by force of design. The Great Dam of Marib, often described as a wonder of ancient hydraulic engineering, was not simply a structure. It was an idea that water could be held, shared, directed, and turned into stability. The dam's irrigation system supported dense agriculture in an environment that would otherwise demand dispersal. It offered a different type of security, not walls against an enemy, but stored water against the future. In the cultural imagination of Yemen and the wider region, Marib becomes a symbol of both abundance and fragility. Because waterworks are never permanent in a restless landscape, they must be maintained. They must be defended. They must survive floods, silt conflict, and neglect. A breach can become more than an engineering failure. It can become a memory of loss, a story that explains migration, dispersal, and the haunting truth that prosperity can be undone by a single weak point. Language and writing also shaped identity early on. Long before modern borders, South Arabia developed its own scripts and inscriptions, carved messages that outlasted the voices that spoke them. These traces are not only old, they prove that Yemen's past was literate, organized, and self-aware, capable of recording gods, kings' trade, and law in enduring lines. Even for viewers who never see an inscription clearly on screen, the concept matters. This was not a forgotten margin of history. It was a center of its own world. And culture did not move only along trade routes. It also grew inward into daily ritual. Architecture became a response to climate and community thick walls for insulation, narrow openings, for shade courtyards, for private air and light. Settlements leaned into defensible positions on ridges and plateau edges, where a village could see far, where a community could remain together. Nowhere is that architectural imagination more striking than Sana'a. Set around 2,200 meters above sea level, the old city has been inhabited for more than 2,500 years, and its skyline is built from multi-storied tower houses, earth turned into vertical geometry. Its heritage is recorded in staggering detail, dozens upon dozens of mosques and public baths, and thousands of historic houses dense layered alive. The buildings look decorative from afar, white tracery against dark walls. But up close, they reveal something more intimate. A city designed to breathe in mountain air, to gather families in stacked rooms, to hold community life within walking distance of prayer and market. The question shifts again. What does it do to a people's sense of self when home is literally built upward, when living space becomes a tower, and history becomes something visible in every facade? Then far to the east, in Wadi Hadramaut, another human invention rises from a different logic, the walled city of Shibam. Here the towers are not simply tall. They are clustered, tightly packed, sun-dried mud brick structures, reaching up like a forest of architecture. Some stand up to 7 stories high, and the city's 16th century form has earned it a nickname that feels almost unbelievable, a Manhattan of the desert. But the purpose was not glamour. It was survival. Building upward and close together meant defense density, and protection, an urban answer to a landscape that offered little shelter. Shibam also sits at the edge of ancient movement caravan routes that once carried goods across southern Arabia. Its grid-planned street squares, a fortified shape, feels like an organized heartbeat in a wide, unforgiving space. It is a reminder that desert does not mean emptiness. It can mean strategy. It can mean planning. It can mean a city that learned to stand tall because spreading out was too dangerous. And beyond the mainland, Socotra adds a different kind of cultural depth, one built from isolation. The Socotri people have their own language. Socotri, part of the modern South Arabian languages, distinct from Arabic in origins and structure. Language here is not only communication, it is an archive of how an island names wines, seasons, plants, and sea conditions. It carries knowledge that never needed to be written down, to remain precise knowledge that lives in speech and storytelling, in the practical poetry of survival. On Socotra, culture is braided with ecology. Fishing, herding, harvesting, and local craft traditions are shaped by monsoon rhythms and the island's sparse resources. Even the famous dragon's blood tree becomes cultural as well as biological resin, used stories told shade valued. In a place this isolated, the boundary between nature and heritage blurs. The landscape is not scenery. It is family memory. So, Yemen's early culture can be understood as a spectrum of adaptations. Terraces that domesticate mountains, waterworks that attempt to tame valleys, cities built from earth that rise into art trade routes, that turn scent into wealth, and island languages that preserved identity by refusing to dissolve into the mainland. And this leads directly into the next chapter, because once a place like Yemen becomes both a crossroads and a fortress, both a supplier of luxuries and a keeper of rare traditions, outsiders arrive with new intentions. Who came next? Explorers, traders, colonizers, pilgrims, and what did they change or fail to change? Yemen's history of exploration is not the clean tale of discovery that appears in old maps. It is a story of constant contact of strangers arriving not because Yemen was hidden, but because it was unavoidable. The coastline faces one of the world's great maritime corridors. The mountains guard interior routes that once carried the most desired luxuries on earth. And the country's valleys and highlands, shaped by scarcity, produced societies that learned how to organize water trade and power with unusual precision. Long before modern nations argued over borders, ancient South Arabian kingdoms rose here, known through archaeology inscriptions and the echoes of classical writing. Names like Saba and Himyar are not just romantic labels. They signal an era when Yemen was tied into wider networks of commerce, diplomacy, and belief. frankincense, and myrrh, resins used in temples, rituals, and medicine, moved north in caravans, crossing deserts toward the Mediterranean world. The trade did more than enrich elites. It demanded infrastructure-safe routes, staging points, taxation systems, alliances, and sometimes war. In a land where water was precious and terrain was steep, power often meant controlling the places where movement was possible. This is where Yemen's landscape becomes political. Mountain passes become gates. Valleys become funnels. High plateaus become watchtowers. The geography doesn't simply host civilization, it shapes the kind of civilization that can survive. And when trade becomes the bloodstream of a region, every outside power begins to look at the map with the same question: who controls the arteries? As centuries turned, Yemen moved through eras of transformation, religions, dynasties, and shifting regional influences. Islam arrived and reshaped the cultural and political framework of the peninsula, tying Yemen into the wider intellectual and spiritual world of the Islamic civilization. Cities became places of learning law and exchange, not only markets, but memory. Some towns gained reputations for scholarship and religious study, while ports faced outward, reading the wind and the sea like a second language. And then a new commodity began to link Yemen to global taste in a different way. Not incense rising in temples, but coffee rising in cups. On the Red Sea coast, the port of Mocha al-Maka became a name that traveled farther than many empires. For centuries, coffee beans from Yemen and the wider region moved through this port into the Ottoman world and beyond, and Mocha became a shorthand in distant places. For a flavor, an origin, a romance. The truth is more complex than a single port controlling a single drink. But the cultural impact is undeniable. Yemen became associated with coffee at a global scale, and that association still survives in language long after trade routes changed. To imagine Mocha at its height is to imagine ships waiting in heat haze, merchants negotiating in layered languages, and the smell of dried beans and sea salt mixing in the air. The port's importance was never only economic, it was symbolic. It represented Yemen's ability to export something intimate, taste aroma ritual, into the lives of strangers who would never see the terraced hillsides where coffee could be grown. But trade routes do not remain stable. Empires rise and fall, and global shipping patterns shift like sand. As European maritime powers expanded their reach and new sea lanes grew in importance, Yemen's strategic position became even more contested. The narrow gate of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, near the southern entrance to the Red Sea, sits like a choke point between oceans. Whoever influences this corridor influences more than local commerce. It touches global shipping politics and military calculation. This is why Yemen's coastal cities carry echoes of foreign ambition. Aden, with its natural harbor set inside the crater of an extinct volcano, is one of those places where geography feels like destiny. In the 19th century, Aden became a critical coaling station and strategic port in an era when steamships and imperial logistics demanded reliable stops. British control of Aden began in 1839, and the city grew into a hub connected to global routes, an outpost of empire built on a piece of volcanic coastline. Aden's story is not only about outsiders. It is about transformation, how a port becomes a city, how a city becomes a corridor for labor and culture, how local life adapts under foreign administration, and how identity can harden when sovereignty is compromised. Roads, docks, and administrative buildings can be built quickly, but trust, belonging, and memory move at a different speed. So when Yemen's modern political story begins to form through anti-colonial movements and regional shifts, Aden becomes one of its loudest chapters. British rule in the south ended with independence in 1967, and the following decades saw Yemen divided into two states, one in the north, one in the south, each shaped by its own alliances, ideologies, and internal struggles. And that division raises a question that feels almost geological when a land has always been stitched together by mountains, wadis, ports, and trade. What happens when politics tries to cut it into separate pieces? In the north, the highlands and cities like Sana'a followed their own complex path through the 20th century, navigating revolution, shifting governance, and regional pressures. The south, centered around Aden, became known as the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, taking a socialist direction that set it apart in the Arabian Peninsula. For years, two Yemens existed, linked by language, history, and family ties, yet separated by ideology and power. In 1990, the two states unified into the Republic of Yemen. On paper, unification promised a single national horizon, one flag, one government, one future. But unification is not the same as healing. The process carried tensions, political, economic, and regional, and those tensions erupted into conflict in the mid-1990s. The scars of division did not simply vanish. They settled into the background, like sediment shaping distrust, shaping grievances, shaping the way communities interpret state authority. At the same time, Yemen's older cities continue to hold their own form of continuity, an architectural history that does not depend on modern stability to remain meaningful. Sana'a's tower houses, with their geometric windows and white painted patterns, stand like stacked chapters of family life. They were built from earth and stone, but maintained through social rhythm repairs, replastering the quiet labor of keeping walls sealed against rain and time. Shibam in Hadramaut remains one of the most astonishing examples of vertical mud brick urbanism, a city designed not only to live in, but to defend. And then there are places like Zabid, once a center of Islamic learning, later recognized as a historic town whose survival depends on preservation and peace. These towns reveal another truth. Yemen's heritage is not carved into immovable granite. It is made of materials that demand care, mud brick plaster wood, and that care depends on stability, community, and resources. Beyond cities and ports, Yemen's history also includes migration that moved outward rather than inward. Hadramaut, in particular, is linked to a wide diaspora communities of Yemenis who traveled across the Indian Ocean to East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia over centuries. They carried commerce, religious scholarship, and cultural ties, weaving Yemen into distant coastlines. This outward movement complicates the idea of Yemen as isolated. Even when Yemen struggled internally, Yemenis were present in other worlds, creating networks of family and trade that could outlast governments. So the historical development of Yemen is not a simple rise and fall. It is a repeated pattern. Yemen becomes a crossroads. Outsiders arrive. Local systems adapt. Tensions grow, identities harden, and the land's strategic value keeps pulling it back into global attention. And that leads into the present with uncomfortable clarity, because when a place holds such beauty, such heritage, and such strategic geography, modern pressures rarely arrive gently. What happens when history stops being a background and becomes the daily weather of ordinary life? Modern Yemen cannot be described honestly without acknowledging how tightly daily life is tied to crisis and how stubbornly culture continues anyway. After years of conflict and economic strain, humanitarian needs remain vast. UN reporting for the 2026 Yemen Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan lists about 23.1 million people in need, with 10.5 million targeted for assistance at the plan's launch in late 2025. In 2025, OCHA similarly warned of a deepening humanitarian crisis with more than 19 million requiring humanitarian assistance. Numbers like these can feel abstract until they are translated into the simplest question a household asks every morning: is there enough water, food, fuel, and medicine to make it through the day? Water in particular shapes Yemen's modern stress like a slow, continuous earthquake. UNICEF reporting has highlighted how poor water sanitation and hygiene conditions affect millions, including figures such as 17.4 million people facing wash risks in 2025. Humanitarian reporting increasing disease, vulnerability, and compounding pressure on health services. In a country where terraces and dams once symbolized mastery over scarcity, the present reality often feels like scarcity reclaiming the conversation. Wells deepen, pumps run longer, costs rise, and when infrastructure breaks, whether through neglect, damage, or lack of fuel water, stops being a resource and becomes a daily countdown. At the same time, Yemen's cultural heritage, those mud brick skylines and ancient urban patterns, faces its own kind of emergency. UNESCO has repeatedly stressed that the old city of Sana'a remains vulnerable due to the deteriorating condition of historic buildings, the effects of extreme weather damage from conflict, and limited resources for conservation. One reason the site remains on the list of World Heritage in danger. Heritage here is not protected by distance or by stone. It is protected by maintenance plaster, renewed roofs, repaired walls sealed before rain finds the seams. When a city's daily economy weakens, conservation becomes harder, and the most beautiful architecture can begin to fail quietly, one crack at a time. And yet Yemen is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of continuity, of people insisting on normality in the smallest rituals. Markets still form their living geometry cellars, calling out prices, spices stacked like pigments, bread carried home in bundles that steam in the morning air. Coffee culture persists, carrying the memory of Mocha not as a museum fact, but as a living habit, hospitality conversation, the social glue of being together, even when circumstances push people apart. On the mainland, cultural life often survives in forms that are portable music that can be played in a room with no electricity. Poetry recited without a stage, stories pass between generations, the way terraces pass down slopes. Celebrations and religious seasons still shape time, reminding communities that the year contains more than emergency. In many places, weddings still happen, sometimes smaller, sometimes postponed, sometimes adapted, because culture does not ask permission from politics to exist. But the modern era adds a new tension, the world's renewed attention, arriving through headlines rather than caravans. Yemen's strategic geography, especially near Red Sea shipping corridors, has pulled international focus in ways that can increase pressure on civilians and infrastructure. When global conflicts and regional rivalries intersect with Yemen's geography, the consequences are rarely confined to a single front line. This is where Socotra becomes a symbol of the entire contradiction. For years, Socotra has been portrayed as untouched, a rare place where nature appears to have survived history. Conservation assessments warn, however, that threats to Socotra's values are increasing, including infrastructure development, invasive species, land use change, and unsustainable resource use. UNESCO-linked initiatives have also emphasized the need for sustainable tourism and heritage conservation on the archipelago, precisely because attention can be its own form of damage when it arrives too quickly. And in early January 2026, the fragility of paradise tourism became painfully literal. Reporting described hundreds of tourists stranded on Socotra after flight disruptions amid political and security shifts, an image that feels almost surreal. Visitors trapped on an island marketed as remote serenity, suddenly confronted with how dependent that serenity is on stable logistics and governance. It is a modern parable of Yemen itself. Even the most beautiful places are connected to systems that can break overnight. So modern Yemen exists in overlapping realities. There is the Yemen of heritage Sana'a's patterned windows and Shibam's vertical mud brick streets. There is the Yemen of ecology, Socotra's rare species and vulnerable landscapes. There is the Yemen of daily culture, coffee hospitality, craft rhythm, prayer music. And there is the Yemen of crisis water stress, fragile services, and the long shadow of conflict. The question that hangs over all of it is not only what Yemen has endured, but what it can still preserve when preservation requires more than admiration. It requires stability, resources, and time. Because if a place's greatest treasures are made of mud memory and living ecosystems, what does protection truly mean in the modern world? Yemen is often reduced to a single headline, but the land itself refuses to be simplified. It is a country built on contrasts so sharp they feel impossible: mountains high enough to cool the air coastlines, hot enough to shimmer valleys carved by floods that vanish as quickly as they arrive, and offshore, an island where evolution seems to have taken a different path entirely. In Yemen, the earth is not a silent stage. It is an active force. Rift lines pull the crust apart in slow motion. Wadis rewrite their own routes. Monsoon winds shape shorelines and schedules. And in the middle of all that motion, people built upward mud brick cities that stand like stacked memory terraces, that climb slopes like proof of patience, and rituals that turn scarcity into community. Yet the beauty here is not indestructible. Heritage made from earth needs constant care. Ecosystems that exist nowhere else cannot simply migrate when conditions change. And when water becomes uncertain, everything else, health, work, education, even tradition, begins to feel fragile. Still, Yemen's story is not only about what is at risk. It is also about what remains resilience in everyday life, dignity in craft, and hospitality, the quiet strength of people who keep rebuilding what the world assumes is already gone. Yemen is a reminder that a place can be both wounded and wondrous at the same time. So what does it mean to look at the edge of the world and not look away? If Yemen's landscapes leave anything behind, it is responsibility. Learn the names of the places beyond the headlines: Sana'a, Shibam, Zabid, Aden, Socotra. Treat rare ecosystems as living communities, not backdrops. Support responsible, local-led conservation where possible. Respect culture as something breathing, not something frozen in a travel brochure. And when sharing stories, choose the ones that protect humanity instead of consuming it. Because on a map, the world's edge is just a line. But in real life, it is a promise that wonder deserves care, and that the most extraordinary places should not have to disappear to be taken seriously.